My name is Eleanor Lepinar. I'm a professor of gender studies at the University of Lausanne. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this second session of a series of 3 webinars organized by the Journal Work, Employment and Society on the theme of meaningful work in the digital economy. And our session today in particular is focused on intersectionality and meaningful work. So before I start, I'd like to thank the people who have organized this series, made it possible, in particular Elizabeth Cotton, Valeria Insaroto, Donald Hislop, and Georgina Sales, who is taking care of making sure that everything works with the webinar. And so the next event will be tomorrow, same time. And you can find all the information on the webpage of Work, Employment and Society. So we are very lucky to have a great lineup of scholars today to discuss the topic of meaningfulness and intersectionality, and I will present them in the order in which they are going to present. So the first speaker will be Sara Farris, who's a reader in sociology at Goldsmiths. She's the author of several books, one on Max Weber, a second one in the name of women's rights, the rise of feminationalism. She's also the founder and co-convener of the British Sociological Association study group on care and social reproduction, and the Corporate Care Observatory. And she's also an editor of Work, Employment in Society. Shoba Arun will be our second speaker. She is a reader at Essex Business School, and she's here with us, although she was done with a bad flu. So thanks again for making it happen today. Her recent books include Development and Gender Capital in India, Change, Continuity and Conflict in Kerala, and a co-edited volume, Global Migration and Diversity of Educational Experiences in the Global South and North. And she's also an editorial board member of Work, Employment and Society. And finally, our last speaker will be Professor Jason Arday from Cambridge University. And sorry, I'm getting Teams calls at the Faculty of Education. He's a trustee of the René Midi Trust, which is, as you surely know, the UK's leading race equality think tank, and the British Sociological Association. And his research interests and expertise comprise the advancement of Asian, Black minorities in higher education, as well as issues of neurodiversity and inclusion in higher education. So let me just briefly tell you a bit about the format. So each speaker will have about 25 minutes. We will have a short Q&A for clarification questions after each speaker. And at the end of the 3 presentation, we will have a much longer time for an open Q&A. So how Q&A is going to work is the following. You have 2 functions in this webinar. One is a chat box. If you want to share comments or a remark, that chat box is not for question. And in that chat box, if you want to share links or information with everybody, you need to scroll and on the drop down all attendees so that everybody can see what you've been sharing with the whole people in the room. To ask question, you can use the Q&A box, and then I will relay those questions live to the panelists after each presentation, and then at the end when we have the Q&A. So I hope all this is clear for everybody, and you can, if you need more information, you can use the chat box and we will try to answer those questions. So with no further ado, let's start with our first speaker, Sara Farris. If she is, you can share your screen.
Can you? Yes.
Yes, thank you. The floor is yours, Sara.
Thank you very much. So yeah, first of all, really thank you for inviting me and for being part of this panel. I'm very honored and happy to share it with Shoba and Jason. And so in this paper, I called it now the domestic workers movement and the feminist movement. And I hope it will address in particular, some of the issues that this panel aims to address on intersectionality and the meaningful work. So the paper I am presenting today is based on a research project that I finalized a little bit over a year ago, which was funded by the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust, and the project was actually entitled Feminism from the Kitchen Floor. And the idea was to explore how domestic workers organizations, and so the domestic workers who are activists in workers organizations, articulate and understand feminism. But also I wanted to understand the challenges that they represent, that their positionality in many ways represents for what we could very loosely call mainstream feminism. One area that I was very interested in exploring concerned the intersectionality, and particularly the articulation of class with gender and race in these workers' experiences. As migrant and racialized working class women, most domestic workers find themselves at the crossroads of the main axis of oppression identified by intersectional feminist theories. And yet, while intersectionality scholarship has foregrounded certainly race and often overlooked class, some studies, for example, show that some studies on domestic workers organizations show that class in particular and gender were the primary dimensions noted by domestic workers when asked about their experiences of discrimination. Now, this is not exactly my finding, for example. Race, as you will see, is absolutely central. But this is just to say it is interesting how class really comes back continuously in the experiences of these women, of the activists. So one of my questions in this light was how and in what ways do domestic workers articulate their experiences of oppression in intersectional terms? And I want to add, in what ways also do they articulate the ideas of meaningful work? So with this premise in mind, I want to present very briefly some of the theoretical premises also on which this study was based, that also inspired it. So domestic workers, that is a category that encompasses also care workers who also do domestic work, but also cleaners. So it's a quite broad category in many ways. They have been consistently a very important segment of the working population for, we could say, really 2 centuries at least, in many different countries around the world. And crucially, 90% of them are women. Yet, in spite of these significant facts, they have been erased from 2 very important movements of the 20th century and the 21st century, and precisely those movements that then one would expect to represent them, namely, on the one hand, the workers' movement, and on the other hand, the feminist movement. So on the one hand, for example, studies on class have erased, really, they have not mentioned care and domestic workers from their analysis. Notoriously, both Karl Marx and E.P. Thompson did not include the female servants in their description of the English working class, in spite of the fact that this was the most prevalent job for working women in the 19th and early 20th century, and that their numbers were also very high. There is a very important study by Laura Schwartz, for example, just published a few years ago, precisely on the presence of servants in the British working class, and there are studies particularly by historians on this. For example, in his account of the British working class, Marx and Engels erased domestic workers because they were considered too close to the enemy, beside the fact that they were not factory workers and thus not subject to the type of exploitation regime that Marx identified as the true novelty of capitalism. But even today, even in more recent years, domestic workers are really not part of class analysis. So to give you an example of the nearly 200,000 respondents to the Great British Class Survey that was done around 10 years ago, none of them was employed as domestic workers, despite the fact that they constitute 5% of the entire workforce, so not a marginal number. Similarly, while contemporary scholars of social class have included new categories such as the precariat to account for the important changes brought about by neoliberalism in terms of contract typologies, income, or forms of mobilization and class consciousness, domestic workers continue to be either ignored or subsumed under other class categories that do not fully account for their specificity. And again, in spite of the fact that their numbers have grown exponentially, particularly under neoliberalism. So this is as far as the workers' movement and class analysis is concerned. Now, on the other hand, servants and domestic workers have also been erased from the history of the feminist movement, in spite, again, as I said, of very important presence and contributions. Domestic workers' organizations were very much present, for example, during the suffragette movement, and yet they are not really part of those struggles or the historical reconstructions. So partly this has happened because the mainstream of the feminist movement tended to focus on struggles for political, civic, and reproductive rights, whereas working class women's rights in the workplace were not really a central concern. On the other hand, representatives of the workers' movement themselves, and famously Alexandra Kollontai, had a suspicious attitude to feminists. They didn't call themselves feminists because they considered them as a middle class movement that didn't really understand the struggles of the working class women. So again, there was suspicion on both sides in many ways. But one more reason why domestic workers' organizations do not seem to be part, even today, of the feminist tradition is also because in the decades that marked the so-called second wave of feminism in the global north, there was somewhat the idea that servants or domestic workers were somewhat no longer a significant category of workers. And it was an idea certainly to be proved wrong, not only because they were extremely always significant, particularly in the global south, but also because they, in the global north, from the 80s onwards, it becomes clear that domestic service was not really a pre-capitalist profession in decline, but rather a growing sector employing more and more migrant women or racialized women and working class women. So in the global north, while increasing numbers of women entered the labor market, they sought to outsource domestic tasks, cleaning, childcare, elderly care to other women, often migrant racialized women, thereby contributing to the growth of domestic workers and also the so-called feminization of migration. Now, given that women's participation in the labor market and their economic independence was one of the main demands of first and second wave feminism, scholars began to question whether feminists had unwittingly created a system where the liberation of one group of women implicitly depended on the exploitation of another group of women. So how do self-identifying feminists hiring domestic workers, for example, reconcile it with their commitments to free all women from traditionally feminized roles and exploitative working conditions? And how do domestic workers experience their working conditions? There have been a lot of studies that have explored either of these questions. But what I want to highlight briefly, there are more and more studies actually that are coming out in the last, I would say, 7 to 10 years about the domestic workers movement, but also the relationship with the feminist movements, particularly in Latin America, where, as you certainly know, the number of domestic workers is really the most important category of work for women. But what's interesting for me is the ways in which these two categories, domestic workers movement on the one hand and feminist movement on the other hand, continue to be thought as separate, even if they are composed mostly of women fighting for their rights. So for me, this is a very important and I believe a very interesting question, both to allow us to think about intersectionality, but also about meaningful work. So I will try now to present you the findings of my research. Now, before I delve more into this research, as I said, it was funded by the British Academy, and it sought to explore these issues on feminist domestic work. And I did it mostly through focus group interviews with domestic worker organizations in 4 countries. I will tell you more about this in a second. I want to give you just a little bit of a background on the domestic workers movement. Since the mid-2000s, domestic workers organizations have grown massively in number and in influence, and they have been able to gather really important international support. For example, it was pivotal to this, the founding of the International Domestic Workers Federation in 2008, and then the passing of International Labour Organization Convention 189 concerning decent work for domestic workers in 2011. These were very important achievements testifying to the global dimension of today's movement for domestic workers' rights, which is also rooted in a very long history of activism in many countries around the world. Domestic workers' organizations really in some countries date back to the end of the 19th century. So we are talking about long-standing organizations and traditions. Now, coming back to my research, I conducted focus group interviews with the leadership groups of organizations in these 4 countries. Spain, where I interviewed leaders of CEDOAC, Active Domestic Service, which was founded in 2008 by a group of Latin American women working as domestic workers prevalently in the Madrid area. In the UK, the Voice of Domestic Workers, that was founded in 2009. In Brazil, I spoke especially with the representative of different associations that compose the National Federation of Domestic Workers, which was, in fact, is one of the oldest organizations and was founded in 1936. And finally, I conducted focus group interviews with workers from the National Union of Household Workers that was set up in 2015. Now, I just want to say briefly that the criterion to include these organizations in the focus group and in the research, as I said, I was interested in the relationship of between these domestic workers organization and feminists, and especially the ways in which they articulated feminism. So for me, it was important, and these were activists. So women, domestic workers, activists, and active in organizations fighting for the rights, the working rights of these women. But one important criterion was also for them to be organizations that had explicit relationships and also reflections on feminism. So after looking at their documents, the websites they produce and the documents they have circulated, these are, all of them are organizations that respond to this criteria, but also they represent a category of worker that it's very, very significant in each of these countries. This is especially true for Brazil and Mexico. In Brazil, there are over 8 million domestic workers. Is one of probably the most important category of work for women. And these are depending on the part of Brazil, but the majority of women that I interviewed, for instance, are Afro-descendants. In Mexico, we are talking about nearly 3 million domestic workers represented by these organizations. And again, the majority are indigenous women or women from, or migrant women from poorer countries in Latin America. So all these organizations have also important working collaborations with sections of the feminist movement, and they all, for example, supported the March 8th International Women's Strike in 2016 and 2017, but also the Me Too campaign. They are quite, if you go to their websites, there are testimonies, but also letters they sent, for example, in support of the women that they were fighting for against sexism and discrimination in the workplace. These interviews lasted a long time. The questions revolved and the comments really revolved mostly around really the organization. It was very interesting to understand how the organization how it was organized, so the composition, and obviously, of course, the relationship with other trade unions and feminists as individuals, but also with other feminist collectives and organizations. Here, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I want to really emphasize only 3 themes that came through very prominently in all the interviews. So I will look more at the similarities in a way than the differences here. And I will try to do it through excerpts from the interviews. These are a little bit lengthy. As you can see, these slides are a little bit too wordy. Apologies about that. I'm not going to read everything, but I just want to emphasize some of these themes through their words. So certainly the first issue that comes through very, very strongly is the issue of race and colonial legacies, very importantly. All the members of the domestic workers organization CEDOAC in Spain, as I said already, are migrants, mostly from El Salvador and Paraguay, but also other countries. And the same goes for the UK, for the Voice of Domestic Workers, where they're all migrants from different parts of the world. In Mexico, on the other hand, all the women I interviewed were indigenous women. They were the leaders of the organizations coming from the poorest regions of the country. And in Brazil, the women and one man that I interviewed were, or as I said already, Afro-descendants, which is the reality of many domestic workers in Brazil. So they really, I'd like to read maybe a couple of these, just because I think they express these issues very, very well. So Maria from Mexico, for example, she says, one of the most important and relevant issues for household workers, they don't want to be called domestic workers in Mexico. It's also an issue of translation, how it sounds in Spanish Mexican, but household workers is that of indigeneity and where these women come from, the way that they dress, their traditions and native language. The Latin American media and television have also reinforced the stereotypes about household workers, for example, that they are backwards from the countryside, don't know how to read and are ignorant and unintelligent. These stereotypes also serve to devalue and belittle household workers and their profession. Let me just read very briefly a bit from Spain. I think that Spanish society is very racist and fixed on its colonial past. Foreign domestic workers are looked down upon, and domestic work is not viewed in the same way as other professions, in that we don't have the same rights. On the scale of professions, even other professions that are precarious, domestic work is viewed as one of the lowest. And Francisco, the man I interviewed in Brazil for Fenatrad, he writes, the majority of domestic workers are Black women, but there is a small percentage of men that make up not even 5%. The second issue that obviously was a focus of my interviews and the project, but again, that came through very interestingly, was really the relationship with feminism. And it came through really as a relationship strongly mediated by class interests. In the words of Delmi from Spain, in Spain, everyone talks about feminism, but non-white women and immigrant women like us are viewed differently within the feminist movement. And it is even more complicated for us. This is where the white feminist movement does not make sense to us. To talk about feminism in Latin America, we need more social justice and to improve people's lives in general. Something very similar was expressed by another member of the same organization, saying that she said, I felt discriminated against by the mainstream feminist movement for being poor, an immigrant, and a domestic worker. This is how I felt when I arrived. Now, after the fourth wave of feminism, it is a bit different because of the alliances that we have been created. I remember that one of the first issues that I put forward during talks with feminists was that laws discriminate against us, society discriminates against us, our employers discriminate against us. And on top of all of that, feminism also discriminates against us. My struggles are not the same as the struggles of white women, but the struggles and the demands of white women are also what I fight for. And then she makes an example of how they supported the strike, as I said, international strike, but they were not supported in their own strike for domestic workers' rights. And then I'm not going to read it in full, but there is a very interesting excerpt from an interview with Idela from the Mexican organization. It talks about her bad experience with an employer who was a feminist and female senator. And this is a very common story in several countries in Latin America, where, just very briefly, for example, some women, members of parliament, and some of them self-declared as feminists, actually were against or abstained when laws about regulating domestic workers' rights were discussed in parliament. So these workers, these activists actually denounce the inconsistencies that they see between the action of these feminists, of these prominent feminists in some cases, and then the reality they experience when these women are their employers. Now, the final theme that comes through very strongly, and I think it really speaks very nicely to the issue of meaningful work, is the power of organizing. So organizing for these women, really, being part of the domestic work organization is a form of empowerment, became almost a form of consciousness raising, and obviously struggle for rights. For all the women I interviewed, they describe their discovery and participation in the organization as transformative, and in some cases even life-saving. So one of them, Carolina from Spain, says, for 5 years I worked as an internal domestic worker, looking after the elderly and children, spending all day cooking, ironing and cleaning. As a domestic worker, I was made to feel completely belittled and worthless. When I finally managed to stop working in domestic service, I found another job, which was as a research assistant for the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, conducting research about domestic work. Then I worked for the local municipality in Madrid, encouraging citizen participation. I started to feel valued again, and everyone began to treat me differently. I know that it's down to classism, but even now in the streets, people assume that I am a domestic worker. For 5 years, I've been a part of CEDOAC, fighting for the rights of domestic workers, and this is what has kept me from giving up or going crazy. Being a part of an organization and being part of the feminist struggle. These are the things that mean I keep my head above the water rather than drowning. And I just want to, this is really the last excerpt before I go to my conclusion very, very briefly. Over 2 years, we created a national trade union training program, which we have almost completed. In June, our colleagues from different states and the executive committee came together, and in December, we'll meet for the end of this program. The program has consisted of a series of meetings in which we have discussed feminism and the patriarchy, as well as trying to understand why there is such inequality and why we find ourselves in certain negative situations. I just go to the end. Mexico's history of slavery, which is where the devaluation of domestic work comes from. And finally, union organization, so that we can defend our rights as domestic workers. And this is a topic that is not discussed enough in Mexico. So really, some concluding points. very, very, very briefly. So these initial explorations seem to me they show the importance of understanding the domestic workers movement as a feminist working class movement. So in a way, I want to really resist and challenge the separation between feminism and domestic workers. They are different entities, and really to bring class squarely in these intersectional and feminist considerations. Obviously, there are several reasons why this has not happened. They are too complex to discuss here. In part is because the working class has continued to be thought of as male and white. Secondly, in part is because the feminist movement has continued itself to be dominated, at least politically, if not numerically, by white middle class agendas. And thirdly, there is also a complex relationship to unravel in a way between the workers' movement and the trade union movement, which in many ways bureaucratized and has been challenging also for these organizations. And fourthly, and very importantly in the context of this panel, I think is also very important to see how these domestic workers, particularly the way they describe organizing as a form of empowerment, they are also fighting really for meaningful work. And as you know, through the history of the feminist movement, really, one of the main demands in a way, one of the main discussions was around domestic work, a work to abolish, work to reject, particularly various description of this work in the famous work of Bridget Anderson as dirty work or body work. So always pinpointing in a way the ways in which this is work that is demeaning it, as we know, still undervalued, underpaid, etc., etc. And I think what is very important and valuable about what these domestic workers organizations are doing is also to actually try to valorize this work through their fights for decent wages and decent working conditions, but also valorizing by showing how important it is really to society. So I will close here. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sara. Thank you also for keeping the time. So I don't see any clarification question in the Q&A, but I will indeed wait for a couple of seconds if somebody wants to jump in and ask Sara a question about her presentation. And if not, we'll catch up our belated 5 minutes and turn to Shoba. So I don't think there's clarification at that point.
I can see a question from Elizabeth in the chat.
Okay, so I'm looking at the Q&A.
Wondering experience
yes.
of so many are deeply domesticated.
Maybe you can read it aloud, Sara, so
yes.
People can hear the question as well as the answer.
Yes. So Elizabeth Cotton writes, thank you very much, Sara. I wondered in your research whether the experience of lockdown, when so many of us were deeply domesticated, living lives of our mothers, whether you felt there was a shift in our attitudes to domestic work, and whether this experience is being used to carve out changes for domestic workers. A very, very interesting question. Okay, let me try to answer in this way. First, in some ways, yes, I would say not so much in the UK, but for example, in Italy, which is the country I come from and is also one of the contexts that I study, the experience of the lockdown actually was used to make changes for domestic workers. Because if you remember, in many countries, there were benefits for unemployment that were given to different categories of workers. And so, for instance, in Italy, the only category of worker that was initially excluded from these benefits were domestic workers, which is a very significant number in the country. And because of the fights of domestic workers organizations in the country, they were finally included in the categories of workers that were allowed to have these benefits. So this created, there was quite of a discussion around this. And I think that even if for a brief period, I don't think it really changed in the end, their working conditions or their wages, as we know for probably the majority of essential workers from the lockdown. But this was a quite significant experience. And I think it also emboldened these domestic workers organizations. And in fact, it reinforced them, but their numbers also grew. They felt they could have a say in the national politics. Mm-hmm. In terms of domestication, I know of work that's been done on I had a master's student, for example, who did work around how it changed the attitudes and the division of labor between men and women in the household. So they felt that men were participating more and they were also more domesticated. So this really is the type of work that comes to mind now. There is a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, there's two questions in the Q&A, but I suggest, I think the first one would be maybe interesting for the general discussion. So I'm going to save it for later and turn to the question by Elisa, which is asking whether there are solution or suggestion for including women who are interested in accessing and being part of the type of organization that you described, but have language or culture barriers. So how do this, I guess the question is, how do these organizations manage to be inclusive of a very broad diversity of women?
It's a challenge for them, for sure. I mean, it's a challenge because domestic workers is a category that it's very difficult to organize because women tend to work in isolation. They don't share the workplace with other women. And so very often the spaces where they find themselves is really more depending on the country, really is churches. Many of these women come from religious organizations, or in any case, spaces that are outside the actual workplace. And that these are also the spaces that these organizations were targeting. So they tend to recruit really amongst very often friends, relatives, people they know and who, like themselves, are domestic workers. But they also have increasingly done campaigns to reach, for example, in Mexico, I remember they were speaking about how they are trying to work more and more in the poorer regions and also more in areas that are not very easily reached, like in countryside or more rural areas. By going themselves and distributing leaflets. And sometimes there is the issue of translation. They have to write them in some of the local languages. So it is a challenge, but these organizations, try to find different ways to go around it as much as they can. They also work in their own workplaces.
Thank you, Sarah. So I propose that we now turn to Shoba Arun for the second presentation. Shoba, if you want to share as well your screen, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this session. It's been wonderful listening to our day one yesterday, looking at debates and theorizing meaningful work. And also thank you to my fellow speakers, Sarah and Jason, who are contributing to important debates on intersectionality. What I do today, just when I can move these slides, yes, here. Yes, what I plan to do today is to look at, the theorizing meaningful work, but interweaving intersectionality through some of the key debates in relation to gender, race, and class. We heard from Sarah just now about the intersection of race, class, and gender, particularly in the context of domestic workers. And what I would want to do today is to define intersectional identities in relation to, again, notions of class in the global South, the complexities in relation to gender, age, skill, particularly how intersectional spaces are marked by fluid dynamics. And yesterday we heard about how meaningfulness is definitely contested and it is often challenged spatially and temporally. And in this presentation, I would want to highlight the process of international migration, about the power of the digital, which again perhaps will be taken up tomorrow, and the importance of workplace solidarity. I would like to also present 5 tropes for understanding and making of just not meaningful work, but also the worker who's fluidly perhaps conceptualized and contested in these contexts. My contribution perhaps today is to look at how the framework of intersectionality has implications for EDI in the workplace, particularly drawing on some previous work through a multi-power lens in the workplace. I'm sorry, I'm a bit scratchy today, but that's largely because I'm coming out of a cold, and perhaps that is not going to affect my presentation too much. Now, I don't need to talk a lot about intersectionality research. We are very much familiar with the falling through cracks, perhaps quote from Crenshaw, to look at how, many groups could fall through the cracks of race and class through certain multiple disadvantages. And for me, as a feminist researcher from the Global South, I have also looked at, for example, the debates, the tensions of gender intersectionality in its long battle with discourses on equality, empowerment, and through some of the discourses through, women and development, gender and development, where perhaps the focus was more on economic empowerment as compared to intersectionality and tensions that women face in the productive sector and in the reproductive sector. And looking at, the struggles of women, just as we have listened to Sara speak today about the racialized stereotypes and notions of working class women, of perhaps Black women, both in the global North and the South. And we also come to experience these tensions as migrant groups are often labeled as BAME, or perhaps of different experiences of inclusion and exclusion in the workplace. And therefore, perhaps, we need to talk about intersectionality, but also in terms about how we look at dignity and autonomy in the workplace in relation to identity, in terms of perhaps looking at a conflation of identity, the importance of dignity, and perhaps also the recent debates on decent work. Yes, the materiality of it, but also the identity dimensions. But there is also the methodological challenge that we need to talk about when taking an intersection approach. I might refer to some of this a bit later on, but taking a stance on what I would call as methodological pluralism, where we look at perhaps longitudinal studies or perhaps comparing qualitative narratives with quantitative studies. But the caution here perhaps is we cannot overgeneralize when we focus on one form of social disadvantage, and we need to engage with the fluidity and hybridity and the complexity of identities that we face along the way, which then particularly has its own tensions in the workplace outcomes for EDI policies, trainings, and outcomes. Now, trope 1, as I've put here, looks at intersectional spaces, and as invisible, often women's work are often socially constructed. I don't have to say this a lot because we have experienced this, and as the question raised about, the COVID experiences of working, it showed how women's work in the household sector is very much valued within what we have the notions of what work is. I would also want to highlight in this context, the 5 paradoxes that Bailey's work in 2019 was highlighted, where we have the perception of one's work as meaningful or meaningless, in which the individual believes that perhaps their work has wider value beyond the self. And here the typical example would be that of invisibility of gender work through perhaps notions of household relations and work practices through the lens of patriarchy, and how work is defined through culture. In my own PhD studies that I did in the late part of the 90s was through what the ideal worker looks like, or the ideal housewife looks like, and the division between the productive and the reproductive work. Many years later, the consolidation of my own work looked at how women's participation in the paid sector was largely making inroads into the masculine workspace. For example, in the Indian context, where women were getting into paid employment as elite workers, as IT workers, as care workers, and perhaps into reproductive labor as well. Recently, there's so much interest into looking at women's work as surrogates, and we have debates around exploitation and empowerment continuing in a different format. But largely, the debate in the Global South has started off with looking at the economic empowerment of women as a route to development in the Global South, and debates perhaps around decent work and what it means for women from working class, but women in a range of occupations. In 2018, my own book looked at the need to go beyond the patriarchal lens and go beyond the economic lens to look at a feminist Buddhist concept of gender capital, to capture the materiality and the material context, which values masculine and feminine work. At the same time, you see that as more women get into education and gain human capital, there is, for example, interestingly, lower economic participation in the labor sector, particularly in the Indian context. There's a high attrition from sectors like the IT sector, and you can see the penalty for motherhood, which I will be looking about. So, and we also have the continuing perceptions and lived experience of gender and work in many spheres. We have seen that many studies that's coming out related to the research experience show that, again, the invisibility of women's work. The second trope that I want to present here is that of intersectionality in relation to work, skills, and professions. We continue and we see new forms of horizontal and vertical segregation of the labor market, engendering new notions of dignity and meaning. Here we see women's work sometimes seen as lower skilled, working in the informal sector, community work, or on the other side, we have emotional labor and caring work seen as feminine, be it in teaching, nursing, administration. And the meanings and value attached to professionalization of occupations have changed. For example, as I said, the investment in human capital has, of course, seen more women getting into the labor sector, but also attitudes and perceptions relating to certain occupations changing. For example, that in nursing and care work, as global changes to profession and increased demand for workers in the global north from the global south. And we see the influx of migrant workers in professions such as nursing, medicine, IT work, and of recent in care work. And this also means that we see a changing nature of economic and social mobilities, challenging to some certain extent transforming class and caste relations in contexts such as India, making and remakings of IT professions, particularly in the software industry, call centers, however, where we still see there is a higher attrition. In 2004, we published an article in Feminist Economics to look at how women in high career jobs have often faced a motherhood penalty, and that is still the case in neoliberal organizations and workplaces. Here I draw on our colleague Knudsen Carlson's article on the sociological meaningful framework that looks at the objective and subjective dimensions of autonomy, recognition, and dignity, which I will highlight as I go along. My third trope here looks at making new meanings, particularly in the digital sector. This is some of the work that I did as a large DFID project and continue to work. And here we see the value attached to digital work, again, through the lens of class and elitism is interesting. This is based on a publication in Work, Employment and Society, which came out in 2021, which looks at my previous research on IT work and women in software industry in the early part of the 2000s, where we see middle class and upper middle class women entering into IT sector. But in this publication, I focused on how low-income household women, through the focus of solidarity in organizing, work in IT sector, IT work, though, based on group enterprises, and brings about the tensions of intersectionality, given their working class backgrounds, their low income households, and the tensions between the family, the community, and the workplace. The tension arises in threefold. One, given the flexibility and the tensions in the IT sector, where you have longer working hours beyond 7 p.m. at night, made it difficult for these women to return home during the daylight. And there were instances where they were locked out of their homes by their men till there was some effort by the institutions themselves to come and support and bargain for these women. There was also a resistance from, for example, the communities that they serve, working in e-governance circles. I have detailed about their own resistance and working through solidarity in relation to the work that they perform. And here I draw on Phoebe Moore's work, where we as a citizen, as a consumer and a worker, we exist within varied and subjective social relations. And I draw upon my own conclusion that there are limits to capital accumulation in certain contexts, and largely challenged by these intersectional constraints. The top 3 that I want to present here relates to intersectional identities through migrant and foreign-born gendered work, which we have heard from Sara just a few minutes ago. We talk about the interactions of class, race, and gender. But here I speak about a mixed scenario where we have caring work, which is often low valued, interspersed with race, ethnicity, and class, present both empowering and disempowering experiences, where you see the increased migration of doctors and medical professionals into the NHS of the UK was followed very much by nurses and care workers from the early 2000s and in the recent years. We see a simultaneity of feminization of nursing, but also increasingly masculinization of nursing, but also it leads to demasculinization, where men who come as care or as dependents then perhaps take on other less skilled jobs or become carers for children and so on. So there is a kind of changing class relations where you see where nursing is seen as perhaps not much valued occupation elsewhere, then actually transcends these class relations with time. And therefore, I again draw upon Bailey's work here about how the meaningfulness of work sometimes changes temporally, spatially, but also perhaps through a longitudinal view of what we talk about social mobility. So the value attached to migrant work and workers. Particularly during the COVID, I want to highlight on some of the research that we did. And we reflected on the value that we attach to migrant work and workers. And for some time, there was a valorization of migrant frontline workers, as you could see, as doctors, as nurses, as care workers. We even recall the picture that the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson highlighted his attribute and gratitude to migrant nurses or foreign-born workers. But very shortly after, we could see that the health and care visa fees was cancelled. But only now we can realize that it has not only increased, but also there are restrictions on care workers to bring their families. So there is a penalty that migrant workers pay even when delivering very important work, or some would say meaningful work in the UK context. There we here witness temporal and spatial intersectional ruptures. There are continuities of perhaps racism and discrimination and conflict, but there is also change. I also wanted to draw on some of the experience of academic work experience that we have seen, especially Silva St. John's work about the use of the discourse of meritocracy, and for how, for example, female academics do face or foreign-born academics face a number of discrimination in the meritocracy system in UK universities. Now, the fourth trope that I want to present here is that of intersectional identities, and this is an important piece of work which I felt that brought about intersection of gender and aging through the lens of migration. This again is an article that was published in Work, Employment and Society in 2023, looking at the case study of Gurkhas in the UK who have settlement visas. We refer to them as the warriors and the warrior wives, and how for them work actually meant identity making. And identity making was through psychosocial resources, drawing on the Gurkha identity for socially anchoring in the British entrepreneurial field. They drew on their Gurkha traits of loyalty to the crown. We had very interesting images of how they decorated their pubs with the British images, loyalty to the crown, loyalty to the British army, the valor, the pride, and also perhaps the courage that they have shown in terms of the loyalty to the British army. So here we see that meaning is, of course, shifting as we see that it is in a subjective assessment that is grounded in an external objective context that shapes and legitimizes what may be considered meaningful by the individual, which again is quite relative as well. Final trope that I would want to highlight here is that of building our debates, particularly Konrad's, Lasser's and Carlson's work on how the building of value of low-skill work and meaningful work. And I draw on my own recent project here by the ESRC, looking at transforming relational and responsive autonomy in the workplace of garment sector in Leicester and in Bangladesh. I draw upon the long-standing debates about gender and skill and nimble fingers and docile workers, but the importance of solidarity. What we do here is also resonating what we heard yesterday about the need for making of the citizen through ethical work and choices, but also perhaps going beyond the objective and the subjective and expanding the intersubjective realm of meaning. And this is some ongoing work that I'm undertaking with colleagues. What we want to do here is to consolidate those intersectional workplaces where the conflation of skill, gender, race, and class come together to strengthen worker voice, where making use of our meaningful interventions and outcomes for safe work, particularly through recent legislation such as the modern slavery legislations, the Bangladesh Accord and Alliance, and to bring about changes in the ready-made garment sector in Leicester and Dhaka to see how we can bring some shared meaning for exploring worker voice, even through digital forms and participation. We work with a range of worker-centered organizations, for example, fashion worker organizations in Leicester. The focus of this study is to look at access to remedy, to show how workers make use of their own voice to upskill their what is perceived as low-paid jobs, but with dignity, autonomy, and recognition in, but also beyond the workplace, largely because many of these groups come from migrant groups, many of these are women, and perhaps do not have a voice beyond the workplace. And therefore, what we want to see is how we can actually strengthen their access to remedy and to help in upskilling these perceived low-paid jobs. In terms of time, let me, yeah. Yes, some of the emerging themes that this is where perhaps I wanted to spend some time, if possible, is to moving from debates on gender and empowerment, but also look at workplace autonomy, which is subjective and subjective and objective, but drawing on the intersubjective as well, because of the relational aspect of voice, the relational aspect of workers, what they feel and what they share with other workers. And I think for intersectionality, this will be more interesting. We have just started our field work with different categories of workers, both in Dhaka and Leicester, and I'm looking forward to see how we can measure this. I also draw upon Bailey's important paradigm, or perhaps a paradox here to say, is that we avoid static accounts of meaning making. We have to look at perhaps longitudinal snapshots of research to expose some of the tensions between definitions of work and opening up the possibility of intertemporal and interspatial account of meaningfulness. And this is perhaps the aim of the research project. We also want to sustain a sense of meaningfulness, and this is where I feel that longitudinal studies help in the methodology of intersectionality. For example, some of our previous work into looking at the nursing professions benefited from looking at inter and intragenerational mobilities. One of the examples was that of how gender was used as capital, and the value attached to nursing changed, the class dimensions attached to, or stereotypes attached to nursing and care work. But going back 15, 20 years, you can see that the changes that they have made to their own lives and to their children's lives. When we go back in some of the re-research done with these groups, we find that they have great pride in what they've achieved, just not within their families, but also what for their children, for the household welfare, for the community back home, and so on. And therefore, perhaps there should be, I think, perhaps a broader conceptualization of meaningfulness in certain contexts and in certain occupations. So this also means building on the implications for EDI debates and how do we define intersectional identities, particularly when migrant groups are conflated with with race and ethnic groupings, with migrant versus foreign-born lived experiences, and how we map inclusion in the workplace. Particularly when some of the disempowering aspects of migrant workers are seen in the workplace. For example, care workers are unable to bring dependents from March 24. So we see displaced care systems where we see care workers who are denied a family life to continue care work and life in the UK. And this again showed changing varied expectations of culture of gender norms in the workplace. And finally, how do we unpack some implications for intersectional research and meaningful work? How do we unpack the broad range of gender experiences through culture, through race, ethnicity, sexuality, binaries? And I've done only just try to scratch the surface here by focusing on the intersection of gender, class, and race. And also the focus of identity representation with the workplace, the importance of relational identity, and how we reflect on training interventions and engaging with unconscious bias at all levels, from the macro to the meso to the micro. We also see that intersectionality has its own challenge in addressing the invisible and multiple roles of gender, and the meanings attached to work and workers that is challenged continuously, both temporally and spatially, through work and beyond for justice. I draw upon Thatcher's work here, which looks at some of the organizational and interpersonal and individual responses here through challenging our own norms on an everyday basis, the DE policies in place, and support programs. For example, one of the findings that they bring about is the role of managers in the workplace, where they allow the transitions of different groups of workers and the experiences in the workplace. And these need to be altered to reshape workers' experiences of intersectionality and to develop positive diversity complaints. Positive diversity climates. Sorry, I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation time, but if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shoba. Thank you so much for keeping the time perfectly and pointing to such a broad range of interconnected questions and issues, and giving us a lot of paths and ideas to elaborate on the tension that you've seen in your research. So again, you can use the Q&A to ask specific question. So there's one by Katie Bailey. Says, I am interested to know more about how you conceptualize meaningful work versus dignified work in the context of low-skilled workers from an intersectional perspective. which is a broad question.
Yes, it is. Thank you. But I think a very important question, Katie, because I was listening to I think your own talk yesterday to look at the implications or the contestations of what is meaningful work, and for me, it is not the low skill that is the conceptualization. It is about what that low skill work actually brings in for the worker. So the subjective perception of the worker matters here. If you speak to what we perceive as low skill, the group of women that I spoke to in the Indian context came from low income backgrounds. And for them, their option was to be as domestic workers, as public office cleaners. And that was the option. And from then they went on to training into basic diploma in IT and got on to low-end IT jobs. They were still perceived as low skill, but the meanings that they attached to the work reflected to what that work achieved, not them for themselves and their families. For these women, they felt that they had status. I think status was the most important thing within intersectionality framework that I used. It is just not skill, but it was more related to status, dignity, and autonomy. So the same framework that we would use in any profession could be applied to low skill. And within intersectionality as well, I think somehow we need to bring the trope of skill into the question about intersectionality. I don't know how we're going to do this, but I think if we can bring back the framework of dignity and perhaps autonomy into this, and as previous work has seen, we reframe what we perceive as low skill as upskilled. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but that's perhaps my response or the way that I would go.
Thank you so much, Shoba. So there's a question by Elizabeth in the chat, but I feel maybe indeed it would be a question for the broader discussion. And if that's okay with you, Shoba, and that also gives you a bit of time to think about it, because it's a big question. And I think the other panelists might also want to share their thoughts on Elizabeth's question in the chat. And last, maybe there's another question that just popped up in the Q&A. I was wondering if you observed an interplay between the objective and subjective dimensions of meaningful work in your data. It's true that you've just mentioned a bit of that. Maybe you want to elaborate a bit further.
Yeah, very much so. I didn't get into this because we heard we have heard so much about the objective and the subjective. So perhaps in my own context, the objective would be, for example, pay, working conditions, and so on. But the subjective was more about solidarity, how working women worked together, particularly in the South Indian context of Kerala, where I was working, through a very effective mechanism of group enterprises. Women from similar backgrounds, similar social locations got together, and for them shared meanings, I think brought them notion of what we would call as empowerment, and economic empowerment was just the start of it. So therefore the connection between the objective and the subjective was very important in that context, where yes, pay is important, and most importantly, the pay from IT sector was the same as, for example, pay from working in similar group enterprises. And yet these women felt that working as a group in lower end IT sector work was much more prestigious than going into other forms of working. And for them, so that status was important, but also that solidarity between the women from similar social locations brought a lot of confidence to women, brought a lot of, for example, notions of capital, social capital, for example, human capital, other forms of, autonomy that they experience in their day-to-day life, and also as a route to changing gender relations in some way. I mean, not in a drastic way, but in some way. So perhaps they had greater bargaining power in the immediate circle. So yes, the connections between the objective and the subjective was very much marked. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Shoba. So we turn to our last but not least panelist, Jason. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. And it's such a privilege to be here with Shoba and Sara. Like, it's been amazing just kind of listening to the amazing, impactful research they're doing. And just thank you so much to the kind of BSA events team, and especially to Elizabeth for having me here today. So I think there's been some really important and seminal kind of musings around some of the work in this space intersectionally, and kind of what some of the kind of pertinent areas are for consideration, particularly in relation to how women experience these issues in the workplace. And I guess what I'm going to speak to is kind of broadly intersectionality in education, but kind of where we are now and why as an instrument or a vehicle for kind of liberation, it's so much more important than it ever has been. I'm going to speak for probably no more than 15 minutes, just to get us on track for the Q&A, because it'd be interesting and good to hear from what all of you as participants have to say as well. I think one of the main things at the moment is working conditions, and I think Shoba kind of alluded to this towards the end of her amazing talk. It's really interesting to see where we've moved to in the last couple of years, and if we just kind of work within the kind of timescale of, I guess, between 2019 and where we are now, I think COVID obviously had a huge impact on how people engage in work-based practices. And I think one of the things that's kind of been compromised significantly as a result is mental health and well-being. And I think one of the issues that I've become quite fixated with over the last couple of years is how do we safeguard the mental health of staff? A lot of my research is focused predominantly on Black and ethnic minority mental health in educational spaces, given the hostility and the institutional systemic problems around those spaces. But I guess more broadly and across the kind of intersectional canon, one of the things that I think has become really intriguing is really are workplaces fit for purpose in terms of supporting people with kind of multi-sectional needs. Now, I guess when we look across the intersection, one of the things that's become a really salient issue has been, for me, kind of precarity. I think precarity is something that always existed in higher education, but over 70% of contracts in higher education are precarious. So you have people who are working on these kind of precarious contracts. And there is kind of an exploitation in higher education now that has placed people in great vulnerability if we just kind of think about the workplace. And I guess from an intersectional point of view, if we break it down and we look in terms of kind of class, race, ethnicity, we break these things down, there are particular groups that are affected more than others. But I guess one of the questions I kind of want to put forward is how do we disrupt some of these patterns? Why have institutions gone this way? Now, obviously, there's been huge political and economic uplifts, which have meant that has reverberated across the sector and has had significant consequences. But I guess for me, from an intersectional point of view, part of that thinking is how do we create safe spaces in higher education? When I say safe spaces, this particular turn of phrase is used in lots of different ways. I guess I mean in terms of the materiality of kind of being economically stable, emotionally stable. How do we politically stable in some respects? How do we create those safe spaces? And I think that's a challenge that we find ourselves in at this particular juncture, because at the moment, what we are seeing is an increasingly there's an infringement on individuals' liberties in terms of what they say and what they do in higher education, and that has become, I guess, significantly problematic in terms of the retaliation to people talking about inequality, generally speaking. So, for example, tropes like woke or tropes like snowflakes or other kind of tropes, which, my own experience tend to be have been racialized, So talking about these issues, it's about kind of thinking about what are some of the things that compromise those conversations happening in real time. Now, I guess from an intersectional point of view, and I often try and draw on Crenshaw's interpretation and notions around that, which are really deeply situated in Black feminism. And we kind of think about representation and what that looks like from an intersectional perspective and how it's been compromised across kind of several tenets. And one of the main things that I think is really important is this idea of belonging. And I guess it's an idea because people sometimes think of it as a notion, but in terms of a praxis idea, one could argue that. And there is still this sense within the intersection who is allowed to belong, who is allowed to come as they are, who is allowed to be free in those spaces. And I guess part of me looks at the kind of typography of higher education and looks at the kind of diversification of higher education. A lot of my work has focused on the paucity of that. So the absence of diversity, the absence of equality, the absence of generally people being able to reside in an egalitarian space, the absence of multi-ethnicity. And I guess for me, one of the things that is really important in that is that those who end up in those spaces, how do they cultivate these spaces of belonging? And if we think, from an intersectional lens, when we think about, race, gender, class, disability, religion, etc., there are a lot of higher education, one could argue, is it doing enough to create these kind of spaces of belonging? And while I'm talking maybe about domestic context, there is a global consideration to be had, which is, are these spaces, do they embrace intersectionality in the fullest sense of the concept? And I think one could argue that it doesn't, because actually, in a lot of the research that I've done and many others of a similar ilk, there is a lot to suggest that actually people are feeling an even greater sense of victimization, discrimination, and feeling the sense of real deprivation in terms of being academically respected or recognizing the differences that in terms of people's academic journeys. I think this is particularly prevalent for Black women in academia and women of color more broadly, but particularly Black women, where there's a significant shortfall of senior Black female academics in the UK. And it's really about that belonging. Why is there this dissonance? Why do people feel that absence or feel on the periphery of, institutions, spaces? How do people utilize, I guess, the tools at their disposal to forcibly assimilate into those spaces? And one of the things that has always kind of caught my attention is the psychological toll that this has on an individual to do this ad nauseum. So, for example, people having to force themselves to assimilate or subverting aspects of themselves intersectionally to be able to, I guess, survive the workplace. And kind of when we think about that, it then lends itself to, I guess, privilege in some respects. So who is allowed to express themselves in the workplace? Who is allowed to come as their truest self? Who is allowed to kind of have belonging almost as something that is just a prerequisite of their existence? Now, that can apply to many different people across many different forms of intersect. If we think about disability, we can think about that in context of people who consider themselves to be disabled or have a visible or non-visible disability, and people who are able-bodied who can create these exclusionary spaces, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And so I guess it's really who is allowed to turn up. And my thinking always kind of comes back to the materiality of, I guess, the privilege of that and the actualization of that, and what does that look like? And for me, huge parts of this are always situated in how spaces are created. So I guess part of our thinking is how to create these intersectional spaces where we embrace and we accept difference, because I think there is probably this idea that we're a lot further along the line than we are. And it's not that I would wholeheartedly dispute that, But I would challenge aspects of that, because in certain areas of the intersect, we have made significant strides, but in certain areas of the of the intersection, broadly speaking, we haven't. And I guess sometimes part of this lends itself to a hierarchy of intersectionality, which is something that I've always tried to dismantle in all of my work. So in other words, there are certain intersections that are more important than others. And we kind of go into this grading system of what is important. So we position this particular intersection at 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. And there are a lot of EDI plans within higher education spaces that actively look to prioritize intersectionality in that kind of performative way, which kind of has this glossy veneer, but in some respects is probably decayed really at the core of that, because I guess in one respect the mission itself isn't intrinsic, it's driven by extrinsic factors. So I think for me these are things that become really, really telling in terms of how we make sense of the space around us, how we kind of construct these identities. And when we think about identity from an intersectional point of view, one of the things that I'm often asked is, are you able to fully be yourself in a workspace? And I guess in some respects, coming from the background that I've come from, I don't really know how to be any different. And because I guess I had a different type of background, it lent it, and I mean background in terms of the jobs I'd had previously to entering higher education, it kind of, you learn a different way of being, in terms of the only way you learn to be is to be yourself, and you kind of see how far that can get you. And even that, there's a privilege in that, because being able to be themselves without having to compromise themselves, it speaks to integrity, of course, but it also speaks to who is allowed to do that in the first place and who forcibly does that. And I guess in some respects, I forcibly did it, but there is also privilege that accompanies that in terms of being in this space now and being able to be that way. But I guess is my kind of guess and thinking is, who else is allowed to be able to do that? And I would argue respectfully that I think, you know, Black and ethnic minority people from particular class backgrounds, particularly working class backgrounds, haven't always been given that liberty and that freedom of expression, that freedom of belonging, that freedom of integration in the workplace. And I guess part of that is really, how do we interrogate those spaces? How do we think about what people may need to feel a sense of belonging in those spaces? What is the infrastructure that needs to be in place to ensure that mentally people can make those adjustments in those spaces, psychologically they can make those adjustments? What is the type of material security we need to think about providing people, so that actually they can thrive from a place of solidity? Because very often, I guess in higher education now, people are often singing for their supper. And if we break it down sectionally, and you know, we focus on particular groups, then is more keenly experienced, and the sharper end of that is more keenly experienced by particular groups. So in terms of thinking about those kind of considerations, I think for me those are really important and salient points. I guess some of the recommendations that I would kind of really think about is really kind of asking us to question what belonging means from an intersectional perspective. So what does this look like for people, for all types of people within the intersection? Why do we place intersectionality, and I'll work with a generosity of spirit, unconsciously in these spaces? So there are particular intersects that we prioritize over others, and I think that there should always be an equal prioritization of all intersections. And then kind of thirdly, how do we build on kind of some of these, we've planted some of this kind of fertile soil. You know, I think we spent many years over the last 10 years or so digging up this kind of toxic soil, and we've kind of returfed this kind of really, I guess, fertile soil. Now it's about how we water that, and what does that look like going forward? Because obviously these seeds, we want them to kind of take as mighty trees, hopefully one day. So it's kind of thinking, what does this look like in the long term? Because I think we have a lot of reactive responses to short-term problems, but actually what we need is something that is sustainable, that ensures that all people really are able to experience the full breadth of intersectional value and intersectional egalitarianism that we should all kind of experience in these spaces. And at no stage should any one of us be having to compromise those parts of our intersection, or the intersections that we belong to, to assimilate into spaces that can be institutionally and systemically exclusive and discriminatory. So I hope that kind of provides a catalyst for thought, if nothing else. Would just love to say again, Shoba and Sarah, thank you so much for sharing this platform. It's such a privilege to share a platform with two exceptional, wonderful academics and human beings. And Elizabeth, it's a privilege as always to do anything or break bread with anything that you do. So thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from the great and good. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jason, for sharing your vision of what's going on. I must say that coming from continental Europe, I'm not sure we have removed the toxic soil, and I see, so I'm not even sure we're talking about like watering something that would be really fertile, and I'm wondering if it's also happening in the UK, but there is also, I mean, quite a lot of a backlash in terms of like, just like thinking that targeting systemic racism or gender inequality in academia is important in academia or more widely in other spaces. So, I mean, that would be maybe something also interesting to confront the space of backlash across different contexts, actually, including academia, of course. So I'm opening for Q&A for Jason. If you have clarification questions that you would like to ask now. I'm trying to, so there's one. Thank you, Jason, for your great talk. I'm interested in hearing your view on how various people of color can build solidarity to transcend ethnic and racial hierarchies. And we have seen some progress following BLM, but how do you think we should move forward?
Sorry, that's a great question. I think one of the ways, I think unfortunately, for Black and ethnic minority people that experience racism in some way, shape, or form every day, I think they recognise that there was an inevitable, there was going to be an inevitable backlash with Black Lives Matter, which meant that the shelf life of it was always going to be pretty short-lived. Which speaks to my point about being reactive. You know, I think a lot of the work that has historically been done around mobilizing Black and ethnic minority inequality in society and politically speaking has been done with the view to kind of being more sustainable in terms of, you know, a generation taking on the charge and then someone else picking up the next generation picking up the baton in some respects. And I think part of it is that a lot of the work that we are forced to do becomes quite individualized because of the lack of institutional and systemic support or systematic support from society and from institutions, generally speaking. So I've always kind of said part of this is coalescing and bringing that work together to kind of, instead of having twitching fingers, having a collective fist. But I think that's very hard to do because one of the fascinating and enduring things about racism is divide and conquer. And it works effectively well because it's able to do this in quite effective ways. So part of our resistance, part of our forms of solidarity is to really push against that and to really ensure that when we are doing work, we're looking to collaborate with individuals and organizations to bring a collectivism to that work that can provide a really penetrative point, or can provide a really penetrative kind of puncture to the inequality that we kind of examine, explore, experience on daily occurrences and daily bases.
Thank you, Jason. There's a question from Elizabeth in the chat, and she's making the link also with tomorrow's talk by Lydia Garofalo about the platformization of therapy. And she's asking, in higher education, we use online therapy platforms for staff and students, and we can be critical of the quality of the mental health spaces available to us. So are these safe spaces likely to be outside of the academy?
That's a great question, Elizabeth. So I've done quite a lot of work on mental health in higher education for Black and ethnic minority staff, and unfortunately, there is a long history of those spaces being unsafe. So more often than not, they compound the psychological distress that Black and ethnic minority people are experiencing, and compound and that situation actually presents more problems with it. And I think a big part of it is the training of individuals that work in those spaces, and ensuring that they are culturally literate and culturally aware of some of the nuanced experiences that Black and ethnic minority people face and experience. And I think there is a long-standing history on the other side for Black and ethnic minority people of distrusting mental health care professionals, given that mental health has often and historically been weaponized against Black and ethnic minority people. So I think that there's a lot to kind of consider in kind of how we engage in these practices. I think making them more culturally sensitive, making sure that mental health care professionals are culturally literate and understand some of the nuances and some of the aspects of how racism plays out in these spaces is really important. But I think that actually comes back to a more primary and embryonic stage of those mental health care professionals' learnings, which is in the earlier phases of their training, or it should be an ongoing part of their continuing professional development.
Thank you. There's a kind of a follow-up question in the topic from Hazel in the Q&A, who writes, as a Black woman and psychotherapist and coach, how can I bring more of this conversation into therapeutic spaces as well as in the spaces of organizations that I deliver consultancy to?
Sorry, I'm just going to read the question again. Sorry. As the Black woman, I bring more of these conversations into. Sorry, I'm reading to myself. I'm so sorry. Can I bring more of these conversations? I mean, it sounds really straightforward, and I wouldn't want to trivialize this, but I think it's just a case of doing it. I think actually that suppression, there is an unconscious suppression that Black and ethnic minority people engage with, where actually they kind of really constipate themselves on, pardon the turn of phrase, but on a lot of this stuff. And I think actually it needs to kind of come out. It needs to come out in spaces. And it's incumbent on the individuals that occupy those spaces to make space to listen to these things, because it's in the best interest of everyone to understand what these experiences are like, particularly for Black mental health professionals who have to straddle and really engage in this high wire act in terms of managing the complexities of race and racism, and also the other intersectional factors that accompany this. And this is particularly impactful, I believe, for Black women who encounter multiple intersectional inequalities in addition to being Black women, and how Black women are victimized and in some respects violated within society. There's a normalization of the violating of Black women in society that is seldom disrupted. So I think part of it is really thinking about how do we as a society create more spaces for Black women to be able to feel safe and to talk in these spaces. So I hope that kind of makes some sort of sense, but it's something that I think it's a really important body of work, because my belief is historically, I don't think we have made space for Black women to verbalize those experiences, even from a psychological point of view.
Thank you so much. So there's two questions, but I think I'm going to take the second one, because the first one is very important, but we are varying a bit off the topic of the seminar, but maybe we'll have time to come back. And so that question is, how can you use EDI policies to further subvert racial hierarchies and stereotypes in the workplace and higher education? And I would add in the context of like increasing precarity of the workers. And so that's for you, but I think maybe Shoba also has something to pitch in on that topic. Thank you. And then we'll move to the broad discussion, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, I'm mindful that I've spoken a bit now, so I'd love Shoba to answer that, because I think her research also speaks to that, and it'd be great to hear from her as well.
Yes, I think for me, I think I'm just going to take a simple stance here and say that we need to normalize difference. That is an important approach that we do it. And for me, as Jason said, keep doing it. And for me, the categories of perhaps race and ethnicity, discrimination, and all sometimes get conflated within the intersectionality framework, and therefore we should be quite clear about which categories we talk about. So from an EDI perspective, we need to examine, we need to be clear about what we speak about intersectionality. Sometimes the danger is that we speak about all difference and do not and leave the focus off, take our eyes off the ball when it comes to discrimination and prejudice. And therefore, I think perhaps valuing difference is a very important aspect, especially in my line of work, particularly with women. Women come from different backgrounds, and their experience is often homogenized. So therefore, I think valuing difference is important in the workplace. Understanding perhaps different gendered behaviors is important as well. In some of the literature that I've read, it shows that the role of perhaps line managers, the role of workplace managers is very important in documenting everyday racism, everyday discrimination, everyday prejudice, and perhaps tackling unconscious bias at its roots. Sometimes it is those everyday talks and prejudices that is converted into long-term behaviors and attitudes, particularly in relation to gender bias and so on. So from my perspective, I think from an EDI, it's about normalizing difference. It's about understanding different social locations and perhaps having unconscious bias as an important, just not mandatory training to do, but something that we address as a everyday practice. So that would be my response.
Thank you, Shoba. Jason, do you want to add something about that question? Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay, thanks. So there were two pending questions, and I propose to put them out there for you three together. So one from earlier on from Sarah's presentation was asking if there are any particular finding specifically about meaningful work in domestic work. So what domestic workers themselves might find meaningful in their own work. And I think it's something that has come up in the first two presentations, the tension between, being recognized as essential workers doesn't mean that the work is considered meaningful subjectively or recognized and dignified objectively. So I think there's still some question around this. And then second question from Elizabeth, asking, following Shoba's presentation, your thoughts about the digital space as an intersectional one, which is certainly true, she says, in workers' networks. So she wonders what you thought about platformization and the implications for the majority of women consumer of e-commerce and domestic service platforms. So how does that play into the dynamics, intersectional dynamics that you've described? Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Does Sarah want to go first? I can take the second question, or?
Yes. No, thank you so much it's been really wonderful to listen to your presentations and really such incredibly interesting questions as well. So I will try to answer a little bit this question about meaningful work, how domestic workers describe the meaningfulness. But I also want to address a little bit what Jason said about mental health and racialized workers, because I haven't done any specific work on this specifically, but when interviewing, particularly right after the pandemic, care workers, domestic workers, the issue of mental health came through continuously. And so I was really prompted to think more and more about this. And so what I want to say is I'll try to relate these two things. because I think they're very much related. On the one hand, meaningful work, the way in which these domestic workers and care workers articulated it was, in a way, a struggle for them too, was precisely to valorize the work they were doing, that they perceived and as absolutely essential, as in fact very meaningful to everyone, but at the same time completely devalued in so many ways, socially stigmatized, considered as low-skilled, if not unskilled at all, very poorly remunerated, etc., all the things that we know. So it was really this struggle between knowing that they were doing something really important for society, for the families they were working for the people they were taking care for, and at the same time perceiving these social devaluation. And for me, was really interesting to, whenever they described the mental health issues, when they felt they really couldn't take it anymore, they were drowning, there are all sorts of metaphors that they used, very powerful really, in order to describe it. I was struck by this constant tension, and the issue of mental health really constantly came at this junction between saying, look, I'm doing something that is so important. I take care of children, and it's such important work. I take care of frail people, of older people. I am doing such, caring, in fact, labor. But at the same time, this is so valued, and everyone is saying how important it is, and how it's really reproducing our lives on a daily basis. But at the same time, I'm treating like shit. I'm always reprimanded when I do something wrong, not really, rewarded when I do actually things right. So there was this feeling of how can I reconcile what I know is right, is good, is important, with this constant undervaluation that I experience. And so, sorry, I'm making it long. I was really passionate about this thing because I thought it was so important. But it really, because obviously I'm not trained in psychology, so I cannot really elaborate on these issues, and it's not really my field in those terms of mental health, etc. But my feeling was that this was such an incredibly important intersectional issue that really spoke. I like to think about it. I was also thinking to try to write something about this in terms of injuries of class, race, and gender. Just thinking of the work of Richard Sennett on the hidden injuries of class, of working class, the violence of class that working class people always experience in their devaluation, low wages, etc. But also, obviously, the violence of race, the constant demeaning made to be felt inferior and unvalued, etc. And gender, these are works done especially by women. So I just want to say these are incredibly intersectional issues, and I think it's really important we recognize them in this way. So yeah, I hope that answers these questions.
Thank you, Sara. Shoba, you want to go next?
Sorry, I was going to the list of questions and I got lost. Okay. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, for that very important question. I mean, as much as platform economy or platform capitalism, perhaps we value it, we find it emancipatory, for example, bringing down cost, giving us flexibility, working across borders, particularly in the garment and the textile sector, it has great potential. But I think for me, I would want to go with caution with what we see in literature and research and what we see around us in relation to platform capitalism. One is a reproduction of inequalities that come with it, who works in the capital economy, who makes the decisions, who is paid and what. I think one of the dangers in this work is the continued low pay, low skill jobs, and the lack of organizing that we see in this sector, the pitfalls that we have in some form of these platform economies, particularly the level of violence sometimes that takes place against these workers. In many contexts, we see particularly the dangers of the food delivery and Uber workers is also translated into other sectors. So yes, so my question, I think, is quite mixed. Yes, there are some emancipatory potential to the platform economy, but it also brings some transformation, particularly in the textile industry, where we have perhaps more choice, bringing the cost down. Maybe there will be perhaps more autonomy as well, but who regulates this is perhaps the wider question as well. So perhaps there's a lot in there, but maybe we can have a discussion around it at some point.
Thank you, Shoba. There's a question that might be the last because it calls for answers from the three panelists, which I'm sure will be fascinating, which is from Katie, around the notion of belonging, which indeed seems to run through your three presentations. And she says that she would be interested in your thoughts on belonging in relation to meaningfulness and intersectionality from each of your own research. Are there different forms or foci of belonging, for example? Can the presence of one form of belonging compensate for the absence of another to restore lost meaningfulness or not? So how does these different forms of belonging may be linked to recognition and meaningfulness, objective and subjective, I guess? Thank you. Who would like to start? Jason, do you want to start?
I can give it a go. I guess the question was kind of in relation to research, so I'll kind of spin off that. I don't like talking too much of research because I think sometimes there can be a massive disconnect between, from a praxis point of view, between theory and practice, and what people kind of theorize about doesn't always actually take hold in reality. But I think there is some symbiosis in what I'm about to say, where there is kind of theory behind it, and it also resides in practice. And my belief is that, particularly for Black and ethnic minority people, but particularly Black people, I don't feel like there are spaces of belonging for them. I think that where spaces of belonging have been created, they have been the architects of that space. So they have reclaimed spaces, reclaimed narratives, reclaimed the orthodoxy, so to speak, knowledge canons, etc., and created space. And kind of in this, I guess, tightening and gatekeeping of kind of what is the broader academy, Black people prise that open literally with their bare hands, and ethnic minority people, generally speaking. So I think having to reclaim that space, there is an exhaustion in that work, and I would surmise that exhaustion also compromises at times people's ability to stay the course in academia, given how hard it is, on top of the kind of systemic and institutional framings that and barriers that stop Black and ethnic minority people progressing through the academy. So I think belonging is at a premium for Black and ethnic minority people, and I think it's still wrongly, might I add, incumbent on them to create and to forcibly mobilize that space. And I think part of what we need to think about is the collective responsibility in ensuring that space is not just open for everybody. It's inclusive of people of all different types, of multi-intersex, and also it's a multi-ethnic space. And from what my research has suggested, not just mine, by the way, many others who've been doing it way longer and much better than I have done, would suggest to me that there's actually still that reclaiming of space. I think there's an expression, I've forgotten who it's by, but it says something like power is rarely given, it's taken. And I think that, people of color are always in situations where they have to take that power in terms of belonging. And it is exhausting, it is mentally and physically taxing, and there is a consequence. And I think the consequence often is the deprioritization and the destabilizing of psychological well-being, which is obviously of paramount importance to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Shoba?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. You know, I don't know whether belonging is a choice that that we can afford, especially from the evidence that I've seen. I think we have to go back to debates, particularly in management studies on motivation, engagement, and, you know, psychological well-being of these workers. And these workers don't enjoy any of this, you know, whether they're motivated to the job, because especially our research with some of the good entrepreneurs, there's no choice. They had no choice to become security guards or so on. They faced discrimination and racism as many other BAME groups face and many of the migrant groups faced. So therefore, when the choice is taken away from them, when the agency is taken away from them, do they have that sense of belonging? I think I doubt it. So as long as the work that they do is not out of choice and it is stereotyped with low skill, low pay, and lack of status, I think belonging will be an issue. It will be great when they have the choice that, you know, they have feeling of belonging and recognition and dignity, and to reclaim that through the work that they do and the status that they have. Perhaps that's just my, I think, what's come to the top of my head. Maybe it hasn't answered your question, Katie.
Thank you, Shoba. Sara, do you want to react on the question on belonging?
Yeah, very briefly, because the workers I research and I've been really working on for 15 years now are low wage, mostly working class, racialized, migrant women. In a way, the issue of belonging, I see that differently, and I believe in many ways they would probably see it differently, which is for them in a way to challenge precisely that they belong to those spaces. They don't want to belong to those spaces. And they are constantly told that that's exactly where they belong, that they are told as migrant, working class, low self-esteem women, they belong to the low wage economy, to the unskilled professions. And so this is, in a way, a kind of, I think, a different take for them on the issue of belonging. They have to challenge and continuously this idea that that's where they belong. And the way they try to challenge it when they organize, because of course it's also difficult to organize in those type of spaces for many different reasons. When they do organize, what they challenge is precisely those preconceived ideas of belonging. And they try, I would say, a little bit what Jason said, to create their own spaces of belonging, which can be, sometimes it's friendship circles. One of the things that I found in my research is that these workers are continuously discouraged from making friends on the workplace. The moment they start chatting to each other, which would be a normal, a human thing to do, they are immediately reprimanded. The idea is don't communicate. They really feel, even those among them who are not union activists, for example, they still feel there is something strange going on when they are reprimanded for speaking to a colleague and trying to make friends. And they feel it is a way of dividing them, keeping them separate, and obviously is a way of making sure they don't communicate to each other about working conditions, about contracts, about pay, and they don't unionize and they don't organize. So actually they try continuously instead to create those spaces of belonging, which I think they perceive in conflict with those spaces where they are assumed to belong, but they don't want to belong to.
Thank you, Sara. So there's a last question, which is I will just like take there's only 3 minutes left, so it's really like maybe to end up on a poem, like looking forward toward the future, let's say. Valeria asking what kind of actions? I mean, you've just described some of the actions that you've seen or experienced, but what kind of action do you think can be taken to contest the structural devaluation, especially of care work understood as female work, and to turn work into something empowering, meaningful in an intersectional perspective? So if 1 or 2 or 3 of you want to say a word to that.
Just maybe quickly
Mm-hmm.
for me, I did reflect on that in my presentation. I think it is important that we talk about values and valuing the worker and just not the work. During COVID, we were clapping hands for our frontline workers. And I'm sure, you know, we have stopped that because, you know, we don't value that work anymore. But we also stopped valuing the workers. So we don't care where those workers come from anymore. And therefore, we need to start talking about, you know, the human rights perspective and the value, the dignity and autonomy that we accord to the work and to the meaningful worker and the work. Just a quick example is how, you know, there is very less protection to migrant women, particularly those who have no recourse to public funds, who face a lot of domestic violence in their everyday life from their own partners, from their community, and in, you know, broader racism, and yet they are not protected because they do not have the legal status as dependents. So I think this is just one example that unless we value workers, meaningful work is an incomplete project.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Does Jason or Sarah, do you want to add something in the 30 seconds left?
I mean, I agree. We need to, you know, pay them better. They need better working conditions.
Yeah, value the workers, not only the work. Jason, do you want to say a last word?
No, just to say, and thank you so much, and just to honestly thank Shoba and Sarah again. It's been such a privilege. It really has.
Well, on this note, thank you, everybody. Thank you for people in the audience for engaging with the presentation. And I guess we hope to see you tomorrow for the last session in the series.